Go ahead.
Pretty soon, if you didn't notice, we had a sign-in sheet in the very back of the room. It's going around the room. So as it goes around the room, please sign in. I'd like to introduce the members of the committee. My name's Robert Gray. I'm the chairman of the reuse committee. To my left is John Scruton. He's the Plaistow town manager. To his left is Marilyn Davis. She is an abutter of the site. To my right is Bertha Hill. She is also an abutter of the site. To my right, to her right, is Marilyn Center, and she is a select person in the town of Plaistow. To her right is Tim Moore. He is the chairman of the Planning Board and Conservation Commission. And yes, we'll get to that in a second. Also not here tonight is Lee Komornick. She is the town's planning coordinator. She had surgery today, so she could not be here. And John McCardle, our fire chief, had a previous meeting, so he could not be here tonight either. Since our last, I also wanted to introduce, we have members of the state Department of Environmental Service with us here tonight. Dick Pease, he's sitting in the back of the room. And Bob Manicucci, also sitting in the back of the room. And with the EPA, our regular cast of characters, Jim DiLorenzo, sitting in the back of the room. Jim, John, I'm never going to pronounce your last name, Prodowski.
John Podrowski.
And Angela Bonaringo sitting in the very back of the room. And I don't know.
Can you introduce the gentleman beside you?
He just followed me in.
Yeah, right.
I'm Mike Jasinski. I'm section chief for New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and EPA.
Mike, can I get a spelling on the last name, please?
Name is Pogorski.
I'm sorry?
Jasinski.
Thank you.
Just like it sounds.
Okay, and before we go in.
One more person.
Yes.
Cindy Lewis, EPA case attorney for Beede.
Oh, hi Cindy.
Hi.
I'm sorry, I forgot to introduce you as well. I forgot that you were coming tonight. Before I go any further, I wanted to give a brief explanation. We have a new committee member, Larry Gill. He is a new selectman in the town of Plaistow. Since our last meeting, there was an election in the town, and I was on the Board of Selectmen. I am no longer on the Board of Selectmen, and Larry is on the Board of Selectmen. He is the second selectman's rep to the committee. The selectmen have voted to keep me on as chairman of the reuse committee, so I will continue on as chairman, just so that everybody is aware of that. I want to thank Henry and Davina Schmidt for taping this tonight, and I also wanted to come up to give you an update on the process and where we stand so far and some of the dates that are coming up in the future. Tonight, CMA Engineering is going to give us an overview of their report to the town. And starting tomorrow, the public comment period on this report is going to begin. And we plan on keeping copies of this report at the town hall and at the library. We are also planning on posting this on our website. So that will probably not be up, I would say, until at least the end of this week. Probably I would say by Monday of next week, this will be available on our website so all the residents of the town can have access to it and can read it and can give public comment back to that. The public comments can be submitted to the selectman's office in the town. If you want to fax us comments, you can call the town hall and get our fax number, or you can email the comments by going to www.plaistow.com. The public comments are due into the selectman's office by the 25th of April by 4:30 p.m. Our next committee meeting will be held on April 15th. That will be at 6 o'clock p.m. at the Vic Gary Center. The purpose of that meeting is we have amended our process to allow the potential responsible parties to give comments to the committee on the plan that we have in front of us. And there will be a committee meeting on May 1st at 10 a.m., and that will be at the town hall. And that will be for the committee to discuss the public comments that have come in and to make a final recommendation that will go to the Board of Selectmen. That meeting, that decision, it's for the committee to make final recommendations to go to the selectmen. That meeting will be held either on the 5th or the 12th. That date has not been finalized yet. It will depend on how long it takes to compile the comments and get it ready to go to the selectmen. So either at the 5th or the 12th, the selectmen will be voting on the final reuse recommendation for that site. So those are all of my comments. What we're going to do now is Bill Straub from CMA Engineers. That is the engineering firm that we have hired that represents the town of Plaistow. He's going to give us a brief overview of this report. After that, we will take comments from the public, and what we'll ask you to do is, because we're filming this and we can't hear your voices, we'll ask you to come to the front of the room, we'll hand you the microphone, and you can get your comments that way. And so with that, I'll introduce Bill Straub from CMA Engineers, and he will introduce the members of his team.
Thanks, Bob. Okay, good. Yes, before I get going with a presentation of the summary of our report, I want to introduce the other members of our team, primarily Pat Sherman from Sherman, Greiner & Hawley, who is a planner and an architect. And we're working collaboratively on this project with her in those roles. Working with her is Jeff Hyland, a landscape architect who's had a lot of hand in the depiction of the concepts that we're presenting tonight. And working with me in my office is Evan Griffiths, who's here tonight as well. We were retained by the town of Plaistow to assist the community in a planning process that would result in the development of a reuse plan for the site. We have undergone a comprehensive process that has been as inclusive as we could make it of the interested parties and stakeholders, including abutters, general public, PRPs, and so forth. We've had a series of, I think, 5 formal public meetings representing different phases of the project, from the general establishment of planning objectives through the general identification of the kinds of uses that might work on the site to meet the community's objectives, to a final design interactive session held on March 8th, where we developed some final concepts to bring to the committee this evening. We've generated the report, as Bob has indicated, which is out for public review and is going to be posted in the various places as Bob has described tonight. I'm going to briefly describe the site characteristics and some of the planning process. Then I'm going to hand this over to Pat Sherman, who's going to review in some detail the planning process based on sound principles of community planning, how we built this thing from the bottom up. And she'll go through all of that, and then we'll try to wrap it up from there. We'll try to be fairly brief. I think we'll probably get through presentations in much less than a half an hour, and so leave maximum time for questions if we can do that. Again, we set out to do a process which was as inclusive of community input as possible. And with these 5 public meetings, we built the program, I like to think of from the bottom up, trying to establish those objectives that the community can identify for the site, so that the site can be an enhancing of the community and in the long term, as opposed to something which is of detriment to the community. So we looked at the planning process as identifying the types of things that could be done at the site, how the site could draw the rest of the community into the site, and make sense from the context of the community as a whole. Very briefly, everybody knows, I think most people have been in this room have been involved in the process at some point. The site is located here, northwest of 125. The village area of Plaistow is down here. It's surrounded by residential development primarily, but Pat will go into that in more detail. As it stands right now, the site involves about 40 acres. There's a so-called Parcel 1 and Parcel 2 on the site, where Parcel 1 is down here, which was the active area of the site. There's an existing building on the site, which was garage and office space for the previous operations. This is the area which is most heavily Sure, thank you.
Thank you.
Great pictures of my back. With the most area of contamination, and Parcel 2 is located to the northeast on the site, and they're both about 20 acres. The site has been accessed directly off of Kelly Road. There's no other direct accesses to the site currently. It has Kelly Brook flowing along much of the perimeter, which has wetlands associated with it, and actually has some opportunities associated with it as well. It's surrounded by residential development on most sides, about 3 sides, fairly dense residential development, and on the north side, northeast side, Old County Road is a perimeter on the other side of Kelly Brook, which connects out directly to 125 at a good intersection with industrial land here and town land here and town land beyond. Bear with me. Without going into too much detail, we've attempted to summarize the environmental conditions on a single figure which is included in the report. And for purposes of general thinking, I would suggest the following: that we think of this as 3 primary contamination issues. The first is associated with the blue hatching here, which is contaminated soils, which were contaminated with when oil and other materials were dumped on the site, and the leaching of certain contaminants, primarily PCBs and lead, were accumulated in the near surface soils down to a depth of 1 to 2 to 10 feet. And they exist today, and that's a major issue with management of the site. Below that, and indicated in the green cross-hatching here, is an area at the water table or near the water table, 15, 20 feet down, where there's a contamination zone of organic material separate from the contaminated soil, but related through its origin. And this is called, interestingly, the smear zone. But that's the term of art, term of science that describes it. And there's what that amounts to is an existing source of potential contaminants for the future for groundwater. What's indicated here in orange is the extent of the groundwater contamination plume that has existed and exists today at the site, which emanates from, generally, the source area outwards to Kelly Brook and a bit off-site of Kelly Brook here. So think of this in terms of 3 problems that need to be addressed: soils, deep soils, the smear zone problem, continuing source of contaminants, and the existing groundwater plume that's emanating from the site. To try to help visualize this is a cross-section cut about through here. So if you take a knife and slice down here and open up and look at the side of it, there's a cross-section here, if you can envision that. Where on the surface we have these contaminated soils at various depths, based on the past practices at the site, which vary in depth from about 2 feet. There's pockets that are deeper than that. There's a pocket in the middle which is somewhat deeper than that. This is, for purposes of our thinking, almost entirely separate from the groundwater contamination at the site. The contaminants up here are lead and PCBs. They're not leachable. They don't migrate to groundwater anymore, and are a hazard in their potential to contact people in terms of physical contact and ingestion and so forth. Contamination is substantial. These are high concentrations of both PCBs and lead. Down here near the water table, which is depicted in this blue line, is depicted in as this blue shaded area, the so-called smear zone, with VOC contamination, volatile organic contamination, different kinds of compounds. And as the water table comes up and down seasonally, this becomes a continuing source of groundwater contamination. The groundwater contamination emanates from this and moves across the site, as shown in the orange here. So contamination here, ongoing source, and the groundwater plume that's emanating from the site. Okay, that's a basic setting for the issues that we're dealing with and some of the constraints that we're dealing with from the get-go here. In terms of the timelines, I want to make one other point here before I hand this over to Pat. The timelines for remediation, this is important because it affects how we conceived of, with the process here, some of the concepts which we carry through. The soil excavation or remediation can be accomplished in a fairly short time frame, maybe a couple of years, maybe 3 years, maybe something like that, but it's not a 10 or 15-year process. It's something that can be mobilized. The contractors can come in, and with further design, these soils can be removed or dealt with in a fairly short period of time in the context of everything that we're talking about here. So with the soil dealt with, that allows areas of the site, vast areas of the site, to potentially become available for reuse. The second zone has been characterized as the smear zone, is to be removed through some process including soil vapor extraction, which is a technical term, maybe thermally enhanced, maybe and other measures to deal with that. The time frames for that removal vary depending on the estimates, but they're talking about 2 or 3 years in addition to the soil excavation. So that puts it out in a 5 or 6 year time frame at the near end of anybody's estimates. So when these two issues become accomplished, this blue area is resolved, this green area is resolved, and we're left with the groundwater contamination plume. In that cross section we looked at before, the groundwater contamination plume is at depth. It's deep. And the mechanisms for removal and treatment of that plume involve relatively few facilities. So this is facility intensive, this is an intensive construction operation, but when these are resolved, that the surface of the site potentially becomes available for other uses because the health risks associated with the deep groundwater are only associated with drinking of that groundwater. And if it's deep and it's not used as a water source, it can be remediated while other uses of the site continue, potentially. Okay. With that, I'm not going to get into the planning process per se. I'm going to ask Pat to do so, and she'll walk us through the fundamental community planning process that we've undergone with all your help. I would like to acknowledge the participation of everybody involved, and particularly the task force. It's been a remarkable experience in working, very thoughtful comments, very insightful comments, throughout this process, and I thank you for that. So, Pat.
Do you want to be my Vanna White?
Sure.
Okay. Great. Okay. The goal of the planning process. What we were asked to do was to work with the community and obviously the task force to develop a plan for this 40 acres as if it were 40 nice clean acres. The time frame for this plan was seen as many, many years. There was no, we weren't talking about using this land tomorrow or in a year or two. The process that we went through, first of all, had to deal with an arduous history of the abutters. The people had lived with this site for such a long time. We really had to help focus people on what could happen to this site, regardless of what was on it. And that did take a little time, but it did indeed take. People quite got into it and were fascinated by it once it got started. So the first thing that we did was to take a look at the whole town of Plaistow, as you would do in any good planning process. Very often people in a community think they know their town, but when somebody else looks at it, sometimes they learn something a little different. And what we were very aware of when we took a look at this map was, just to give you a little color coding information, the light yellow is essentially the medium density residential for the town. The dark yellow is commercial, which you can easily see follows Route 125, which is the major artery through the town. The purple is also a commercial area. The dark brown are town-owned lands. Some of them are forests, but essentially what you can see is that there is a lot of potential recreation area up in the northern part of the town. What's interesting, though, is how all of this land sort of comes together and almost as at a point just beyond the Beede site. What became interesting to point out to the community was, even though 125 is a major barrier right now, that with some sound planning, it would not be very difficult to connect this whole residential area by possibly creating a village center right about at this point where you do have some recreation land right here. So there's an interesting potential to create a mini village which belongs to the community as opposed to that commercial strip which belongs to all your neighbors. And if that were the case, then this Beede site becomes a real adjunct to that village center. That was sort of interesting for us to take a look at and to point out to people that there was some interesting potential here. So that sort of was part one. The second thing we looked at is, fortunately, Plaistow is going through a master planning process, and the draft master plan is actually, a good portion of it has been completed, which allowed us access to very up-to-date information. Information on population projections and all sorts of things. But one of the things we found out, which probably was, again, very interesting, Plaistow is a community that is somewhat changing in its socioeconomic level. And a statistic which we came up with, which surprised everybody, including everybody in the task force. We went to the records and took a look at the assessed value of the land and buildings for about the 100 units that are abutters to this site. And then we took a look at the average assessment for land and buildings in the entire community. And in the entire community, land and buildings average assessment's $147,000. In the 100 units surrounding this site, the average assessed value for land and buildings is $178,000. Well, that tells you right away that this 40 acres has value, and certainly more value than it's been offering to the town for the last X number of years. That was an interesting starting point, because what seemed like a derelict site now was no longer a derelict site. So on that basis, how do we get a handle on finding out what's the best use for this property? This is sort of a personal brand of planning, I guess, which we have used in other areas in some very large communities. But in order to give people some criteria on which to judge what is a good plan, what is not a good plan, what makes sense in your community, what doesn't make sense in your community, we tried to break it down into what we call sort of a three-legged stool. And the three legs are infrastructure, which is clearly your water, your sewer, your roads, all the things that make you tick, your artery system. The natural and built environment, what are your natural resources, what are your wetlands, your rivers, all those things that you value. What about your built environment? What's important in the community, what do you have to, your schools, your churches, all of those things are your built environment, and your residential community. And then what we call economic vitality, not economic development, but economic vitality. What makes a community sustainable? What's important to not just bring in additional tax revenue, but what's important to give the town a sense of balance and sustainability? Where these three things overlap, the things that end up in this red area are things that everybody in the town should be able to support. And we call this the vision. So what we were trying to do is to use this planning process on this site. And in order to do that, the town had had a series of surveys done to see what people wanted for the site. Some of those surveys were done before we came to town. And then during the planning process itself, other things became important. A lot of things were discussed, some new ideas came up. So what we did is we put all of those ideas into a basket, and we went through this criteria system here at a public meeting. There are the three legs of the stool. And here in this column, if you had a yes in all of these areas, it clearly met all the planning criteria, or it might meet the planning criteria, because nothing's black and white. So we went through all of these uses. These were all the uses that were raised by people. Trails and passive recreation, recreation, which means court sports, swimming pool, indoor recreation, cemetery. And some of these, by the way, came out of the master plan, capital improvement plan. Some of these things grew out of that. Highway garage, recycling center, public safety complex, school, town offices, church, elderly housing, single-family housing, multifamily housing, commercial offices, light industry, and fenced off. That's pretty much runs the gamut of what you can do on this site, maybe with the exception of Disney World. In any case, this was done in the public process with the yays and the nays. And we came up with some major yeses. Trails and passive recreation, recreation fields. The cemetery was one that was recommended. Community education center. Elderly housing, single-family housing, but essentially over 55. So now we had a program of uses that fit the three-legged stool criteria that had evolved from the community. It was a combination of master plan recommendations and community interests, and we could begin to do some planning. When you do this planning process, you really would like everybody to be able to come with their pencil and draw what they want, but we realized that that wasn't going to work. And so we were asked to produce some actual schemes so people could critique them, which we did. We started out with a scheme, Scheme A, which I should be able to find here. I think this is it.
On the back of this one here.
Okay,
Like Hollywood Squares.
I know it. Thank you, Vanna. You look dashing tonight. Scheme A was, what can we put on this site based on these criteria? And it wasn't the greatest planning exercise because we really had a hard time with access. The first things that we were looking at is, this is a heavy residential area. Let's not put anything noisy in the middle of this. Let's try and keep houses next to houses. That seemed to make a certain amount of sense. What also made sense is this is a very nice natural area. It should be brought back to a naturalized area. So why not use this for passive recreation and put in some of the fields up at this end? This is a noisy activity. Let's not put the noisy activity down here. With this, we had two access points off of Kelly Road. We talked about a potential of coming out here onto Walton Road. We even talked about punching through to 125. We ran some of these access things through the DOT and the town, and they said, no way, Jose, do you do this. Doesn't make any sense. We talked about coming through here, but every time we talked about coming through here, this intersection got to be even hairier than it already is. So we were left with the Kelly Road access points, but we also know that when Kelly Road ends up on Main Street here, you've got a couple of very tough intersections. You have one right at the end of Kelly Road, and then you have a more serious one when this comes back out to 125. So we went back to the drawing board, and with the input of various and sundry people, we came up with this scheme. And I think the big breakthrough here in this scheme, I'd like to turn it a bit.
Maybe we'll leave it alone.
Thank you.
Okay. We sat down and went through a brainstorming session on why isn't this site hanging together? What's wrong here? And we realized that we had never really satisfactorily solved the access problem on this site. And in the planning director, Lee, who's not here tonight, said, you know, Old County Road is going to have a light at 125 in the very near future, which makes this an excellent access point. Not only that, but further up Old County Road is a property that the town is going to do additional recreational fields on. So the light bulb finally went on, and we had avoided assiduously any crossing of this wetland because we figured that we would never get it through DES, it would cost too much money, it didn't make any sense. But then we realized that if we could access the site from this point, we could begin to zone the site in such a way that we could put uses next to like uses. If we use this end of the site for, these are duplex units for 18 to 20 elderly housing units, that we could access that off of Kelly Road. It's a density consistent with the densities that wrap around here. It would not significantly hurt the traffic on Kelly Road nor make this intersection really any worse than it is. And it would keep this housing directly away from the rest of the site so you didn't have to drive through the housing to get to the other uses. Then we also realized that if we do have to truck materials off this site, that's going to take a year or two. How are we going to get those trucks off this site without running them through Kelly Road and this neighborhood? We realized that this would give us another super way to get trucks off the site onto a road that already has commercial traffic into a controlled intersection. So now things began to make a lot of sense. And we thought that because we're dealing with DES on the entire site, that this might be a very reasonable trade-off with crossing the wetland as opposed to all of the other issues. And from a financial perspective, if we try and come off here, we figured we'd be into some pretty major interchanges, probably cleaning up either this point or this point and the 125 intersection with this Main Street. So this began to make a lot of sense, but it made most sense in making this plan work. So this was presented to the community, and I think there were what also became obvious, by the way, is that this is something that we could probably do fairly quickly, because this portion of the site is relatively clean. This portion of the site is relatively clean. This might happen sooner rather than later. This portion of the site, which would be the last portion for us to access, might serve quite well as the basis for this community center / common facility and possibly even a church use. By the way, the cemetery use was, pardon the expression, laid to rest. Mostly because if this was the access point and the cemetery was in here, we couldn't quite see the hearse passing through here while Mom and Dad were cheering on Junior at a soccer game. So we realized that this was not the greatest place for a cemetery, even if we tried to access it through here, that the uses really were not compatible from a noise perspective. Now, if I can find Scheme E, is that on the back of here? At the last meeting, when we presented this, there were a series of questions. Some of those questions were, how do you know whether this is enough housing or the right amount of housing? We have another Vanna. Thank you. We since found out that there's a need for 80 to 90 elderly housing units at a minimum right away. So the question was, well, why couldn't we have more housing at this end? So this scheme expands the housing to a few more units in a more phased development. Excuse me while I remount this. There. What this scheme also did was try and put the community center on this parcel, which put additional fields into this center parcel. This seems to us a little tight and a little cramped. This building is really tucked into the corner here. In that scheme, we had really hoped that this whole area would be left as open as possible to take advantage of the naturalized edge here with the river and the wetlands. But this one was done on request of the community to see what would happen if the community center could be on an earlier phase. These are things that we can all take comments on. But that essentially is the bulk of the planning process. With that, I think I'll just turn it back to Bill.
Great, thanks, Pat. Yeah, thanks. So I think you can gather from Pat's comments the evolution of the ideas here. And everything that was done was based on, we tried to lay a foundation of community planning concepts and keep coming back to that foundation to build upon it with more information, more analysis, to come up with either the so-called Scheme D or perhaps Scheme E. I think either one is most consistent with the overall community objectives and tying this site back into the community at large. And each one makes some sense in terms of the phasing, the necessary phasing of the environmental remediation activities that are going to have to happen at the site. So we tried to bring all aspects together, working with the community in this interactive process to get to where we are now. Just a comment on another fundamental aspect of this, and that would be site ownership. And it's the sense of the task force and the community at this point that the town, let me back up a bit. The town has, there are a number of liens on the property. Right now it's privately owned and can only be accessed through exercising of legal mechanisms and so forth. The state of New Hampshire has a lien on the property. The town has a significant tax lien on the property. The town could potentially exercise that tax lien in a number of ways, but in terms of limiting its future liabilities on the site, it can transfer that tax lien to a third party in that process. And the concept here is that any of these schemes are based on a concept where the town does exercise a tax lien, transfers it to another party, perhaps a governmental unit, perhaps a trust arrangement, a limited liability trust, or some mechanism, which we believe these mechanisms are available to the town with the agreement of other parties, so that the fundamental liabilities don't accrue to the town, but the ability for use, the privilege of use, the ability for use does stick with the town, that these agreements can be put together. So, I think that's the basis of what we wanted to make sure that we got out there in presentation this evening. And we can open up for questions through Bob. We'll take whatever questions you might have.
Okay. I guess the way we're going to proceed is if anybody would like to give a comment or a suggestion or what have you, please come up and give your name for our minute taker and talk into the microphone. Anybody? Jack.
Dwyer.
Mr. Dwyer.
Leave that one over there. It's not very long, unfortunately.
The first thing I get to do is turn my back to the camera because it's my better side.
Stand in front of me.
Let me talk briefly, I hope. As I told John and a couple of other folks, I was supposed to be starting a trial this morning, so I can give you my opening argument easier than I can give you what I want to say tonight. The PRPs are appreciative of the committees agreeing to meet with us on April 15th. I want to assure you that there have been some surprises for us as we've listened at these meetings, but we're working very hard to see how your thoughts with regard to reuse fit within what we think the remediation is going to be, and keep in mind that we had sort of a cross-section presentation of the problems at the site. Jim DiLorenzo is back there, Dick Pease is back there. The remedy at this site is going to be done. It's going to be done by PRPs. It's going to be a remedy that's protective of human health and the environment. That is going to happen. No matter what goes on this site, there's going to be a remedy that's protective of human health and the environment. I'm told that as I was preparing for trial last week, there was a meeting of a group of PRPs that determined that none of the PRPs would comment tonight. I was not at the meeting, so I have no clue what I'm not supposed to say. But as I was sitting listening, I had two thoughts, I guess, and One thought generally was to ask folks to keep an open mind. And the second thought was, when you really don't know what you want to say, you ought to talk about things that you know best. And there are two things that I know best, I think. And they both fit into this process a little bit. And I thought maybe what I'd do would give you the PRP's original thinking about the site in a different sort of way. First thing I know well, baseball. I know baseball. I know the Red Sox. Some of you may remember that the Red Sox were sold, what, about a year ago? But prior to the Red Sox being sold, the old ownership had a plan to build a new Fenway Park. And they were going to build the Fenway Park right in back of the old one. The old, if any of you know the area, the old Luby Chevrolet building, kind of in back of Fenway and heading down toward the old Sears building. And the reason they didn't, and the reason they decided to sell the club, was that the Red Sox, who have more money than God, as we all know, decided that the infrastructure costs of building on that automobile dealer site, which had a lot of hazardous waste underneath it, they discovered when they did some tests, was just too expensive. And so the Red Sox didn't do it. And that's, you know, when you look at a site like this, it's not only a hazardous waste site, but it was an industrial site for 70, 75 years. And you've got to look at how much you want to do with that site. And I understand one reaction that says we want to do as much as we can with it. On the other hand, that leads me to the second thing I know best, which is I now have learned in attending these meetings that the correct pronunciation is Plaistow. Some of you may or may not know that at least the old pronunciation where I'm from was Nashway. And that still is by the folks who lived there the longest, the pronunciation, Nashway. And I know Nashway, and John knows Nashway. And I would ask John, and I'd ask any of you who know Nashway, where does the Merrimack River run in Nashua? You know, I'm not proud to be in a city that will tell you that it is built out. And Nashua is built out. There is no land left in Nashua anymore. The Merrimack River, I mean, I see it when I cross the bridges into Hudson. I see it. There's a friend of mine whose kids are my age. They bought a condo now that's down by the Merrimack River. I was down there last time for Super Bowl. I went out and I looked. It's a beautiful river. It's a terrific river. And you know where it is? It's behind all those stupid businesses that line Daniel Webster Highway south in Nashua, and you can't see it. You can't see it. And Nashua has built out every square inch of land we have to the point where, for the most part, you can't see it. If I ask you where the Nashua River is, well, there's a bridge over it. It's Main Street. There's another bridge over it. It's the F.E. Everett Turnpike or Route 3. But where's the Nashua River? Well, actually, the purpose of these discussions is when the PRPs originally looked at this site, to us, the dominant feature of the site, and it is a contaminated site, make no mistake about it. The dominant feature of this site, though, was the brook. Clearly, the brook was the dominant feature of the site. I would ask the committee to, at some point before you make a decision, take one trip to Nashua and look at one place. Look at Mine Falls Park. Mine Falls Park is an area within the city of Nashua. It's along the Nashua River that has not been developed. It's the only area in the Nashua area, the only place in the Nashua area that I'm aware of that's not been developed. It's got two things. It's got more soccer fields than most people need, and probably more than it should have. But it's also got an area that it is allowed to get back to a sound, environmentally sound condition that is walking trails. How far? My memory is the last time I walked it in some sort of fundraiser was, I think, 3.2 miles or something like that, or 6 kilometers, or a great space. And so when the PRPs initially looked at this, we looked at it as the dominant feature here was Kelly Brook. And so when we thought about it, we thought about it initially, how can we, through, maybe through some, relatively sophisticated regrading, whatever, get this part of the site restored to its natural environment as soon as we possibly can. We also looked at the access problem, and I agree. It's an access problem. And frankly, the neighbors have had an industrial site there for a long time. And so when we initially looked at the site, we looked at it from the standpoint of what low intensity use that would not create a lot of traffic on Kelly Road would still allow the town not to spend infrastructure dollars, but to get some value for at least the tax lien that you've currently got on the property. And so those were our initial thoughts in our initial consideration. Having said that, are there things that have surprised us about this? Yeah. The thought that residential should go on the property someplace, frankly, has surprised us. The thought that an access road should cut across what is the most, to us, environmentally sensitive area of the site, or the most environmentally attractive area of the site, that surprised us. We hadn't thought about a concept of a community center, but we are working very hard with our environmental people. You should know that this is not something where PRPs wait until an order is issued to think about how you would go about cleaning up this site, different technologies that might be used. My client, who you know is ExxonMobil, has had a company working for it for as long as I've been in the case, which is about 1.5 years, looking at environmental cleanup issues. We are looking very hard at what you've proposed, and when we come back April 15th, what we hope to do is to be able to tell you a little bit about how we see what you have proposed fitting in with what we think needs to be done from the environmental cleanup standpoint. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anybody else that has a comment? Anyone at all? Yes. Give your name and speak into the microphone.
You got my name?
I got it.
For the rest
They
of
don't
you,
know you.
rest of you, my name is Frank Vanaski, and I guess I'm not sure who I direct this question to, whether it's to the board here or the EPA is, but can someone just outline to me very briefly what happens when the PRPs refuse what we're going to do on the site? What steps take place, such as the PRP says, we're not going to pay for it? What do we do? I mean, just, I don't want greatly detail. I'd like to know that at that point, does it go to some kind of higher-up committee? Does it go into the courts? If it does go into the courts, who gets to pay the bill? Does the town have to foot the bill, or does the federal government come in, or do we get some type of a grant, like we had a grant now to pay for these wonderful people who did these plans for us?
Frank, the plan is going to be submitted, and the EPA will look at that plan and make their record of decision based off of that plan and based off of the comments that they receive from the town and probably from the PRPs too, and then they will issue their record of decision, and it's in their hands at that point. The PRPs perfectly are in their right to challenge what the record of decision, but the town will not pay any money for that. Those are all legal costs that will be taken care of by the federal government, not by the town. Does that answer your question? Okay. Who else? Yeah. Bertha?
Could we clear up, please, the fact that this was not and is not an industrial site? It keeps getting referred to as an industrial site. It never was. Is that true, Jim? Mr. Planning Board?
Well, I haven't been in town since 1920, but for as long as I have been on the planning board, my initial several years, the area was zoned Commercial 1. It was an extension of the Commercial 1 strip along 125. At some point in the early 90s, mid-90s, we changed the zoning to residential, as we did along several different Commercial 1 areas. Because of the way that the town was growing, the residential neighborhoods were expanding, and the need or desire for Commercial 1 areas no longer existed. So as part of that, this area was changed to residential. I'm not sure exactly when, but it was sometime in the early to mid-90s.
Does that answer your question, Bertha?
Hi, just to be clear, I keep hearing everybody refer to it as industrial. And I think that if the PRP is now right up front, it was never zoned industrial. They'll have an easier time with this whole thing.
Okay, is there any other comments or questions? Yes, ma'am. Could you come up and give your name into the microphone?
I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Christine Fillmore. I'm an attorney with a firm in Concord that represents 24 small businesses that are PRPs at this site. And I just wanted to reiterate what Jack has said about the PRPs being interested in working with the town. I didn't really have any comments. I was prepared to give some comments on April 15th. I just wanted to let the town people know that the PRPs are interested in working toward a reuse that incorporates both what they can afford to pay and what the town needs to get done on an environmental and community standard. That's it.
Thank you. I don't know if you've been to any of our meetings prior to tonight.
I have not.
Okay. Well, from the very beginning, the committee has made it clear that we want to work with the PRPs also, and that we think that this should be a collaborative effort on everybody's part, so that we don't have to see this end up where we don't want it to go. So
That's exactly what we're hoping for.
is there anybody else that has any comments or suggestions? Okay, if not, then I will remind everybody that the public comment begins tomorrow, and we will look at everybody's comments or suggestions written. You can call the town manager at town hall, and that's it. Have a good night.